Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 4. Although the camera was used from the mid-1880s to record the features of known criminals for the purpose of identification, it was not systematically employed to document a criminal investigation until much later. In the late 19th century, a crime scene was photographed only when an amateur photographer happened upon some criminal event, or when one was summoned by an astute constable who recognized the great utility of such permanent evidence. Few police forces officially possessed a camera. Daniel Trimble, Early Forensic Photography. Sir Charles Sheridan, a leather case in one hand and a wooden tripod over his shoulder, strode down the path in the anxious wake of Mrs. McGregor, who churned like a fervent little tugboat against the surging current. She stopped when they reached the foot of the garden so unexpectedly that Charles bumped into her. "Oh dear," Miss McGregor said, twisting one corner of her white apron. "I'm sure I don't know what Mr. McGregor will say when he finds out that a murder been done in our back garden. He'll be that put out, he will. There's where he always sets us his rabbit snares." "I doubt," Charles said, "that this event is likely to affect the rabbit population." He set down the case and extended a hand to Lakin, while Mrs. McGregor stood behind, her eyes averted from the body. "I came as soon as I got your message, Ned. I'm very sorry. Artie was more your friend than mine, but I remember him with great affection." It had been over 20 years since those halcyon days when Charles had spent summers in East Bergholt, just on the other side of the River Stour, visiting his mother's family, the Constables. But he had forgotten neither Artie nor Ned. They had been comrades in grand misadventures from the mill at Dedham to the tidal flats at Mistley and beyond. "He was a good friend to both of us," Edward said. The grief was written on his narrow face. "Thank you for coming, Charlie. I thought 2 pairs of eyes would be better than one." Charles positioned the tripod. "And here's another eye which won't forget anything it sees." He opened the leather case, unfolded the camera, and fastened it to the tripod. He had acquired the compact portable bellows and camera in France just a month before. It was the most recent addition to the growing collection of cameras he had kept at his London house. "You'll be at Marston Manor for a few days?" Edward asked, and as Charles draped a black camera cloth over his head. "For an indefinite period," Charles said. He peered into the ground glass viewing screen at the back of the camera, adjusting the rack and pinion that operated the helical lens to focus the inverted image of Artie's body lying on the left side, the neat round hole and the matted blood quite evident on the uniform jacket. "Excuse me, Sir Charles." Charles pulled his head out and whirled around, noticing for the first time that Edward was not alone. "Lawrence, what the devil are you doing here?" Lawrence ducked his head. "Well, sir," he began, "you see, sir, he and a young lady companion discovered the body," Edward put in. "A young lady?" Miss McGregor cried. She stamped her foot. "For shame! What Mr. McGregor will say to such wild goings-ons in the garden, I don't know." Lawrence fairly bristled with indignation. "There weren't no wild goings-ons." He turned to Charles. "Upon my life, sir, 'twas innocent, I swear." "You're acquainted with Lawrence?" Edward asked, frowning. Then, "Of course, he's employed at Marston Manor." "He's my valet," Charles said. "My acting valet, that is." His man had given him notice only a fortnight before, and when he arrived for an extended visit at the manor, Lady Marston had insisted upon supplying him with Lawrence. Charles turned back to the body. "I suppose the primary question is whether Artie was shot here or someplace else." "Just so," Edward agreed. "The ground is dry here, and there's a great deal of bramble. No chance of footprints." He turned to Mrs. McGregor. "Did you hear a gunshot in the last 24 hours?" "Gunshot?" Mrs. McGregor was wry. "Oh, aye, there be many gunshots round here. Mr. McGregor's one of the gamekeepers at Marston Manor, you see. He is about with his guns day and night, he is. Say to him, 'Mr. McGregor,' says I, 'do you never think to lay down your gun and hang up your billycock and be done with gamekeeping?' And he says to me, 'Never, Mr. McGregor,' he says, 'as long as I has me 2 good eyes.' There be that many weasels and other varmint hereabouts, you see. The gamekeeper must keep the game safe." Charles smiled a little. He himself had never been a hunter, and felt it at a deep irony that game was preserved from its natural predators at great effort and expense, only to be slaughtered by the thousands during a hunt. He and Edward exchanged glances. "When can we see Mr. McGregor?" Edward asked. "When he's home," Mrs. McGregor said. "This evening?" Edward inquired. "Certainly. The poor man's got to have his tea now, don't he?" She shook her head mournfully, still twisting her apron. "Although how I'm to make it for him, I don't know, be twaddled as I am about a dead man and young ladies and wild going on in the garden." "Tell your husband we'll stop around at tea time," Edward said. "Thank you, Mrs. McGregor. You may go." He turned to Lawrence. "You too, Lawrence." "You'll remember?" Lawrence asked, and looked warily at Charles. "About Mrs. Pratt, I mean." "I'll remember," Edward promised. Lawrence sketched a bow to Charles and made swiftly for the gap in the hedge. About to return to his camera, Charles stopped. "Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper at Bishop's Keep?" Bishop's Keep was familiar to Charles as the home of Qa'Rajh. He had met the young woman upon her arrival in England and had been quite taken by her, especially by the way she had dealt with her aunt's death. She had in fact quite surprised him with her courage and common sense. They had seen one another several times, and he had begun to think that something might come of their acquaintance. "Yes," Edward said. "When Lawrence discovered the body, a maid from Bishop's Keep was with him. Can you make a close shot of the chest, Charlie?" Charles pulled the hood over his head and set to work again. With the camera's focus satisfied him, he inserted the plate holder and snapped the shutter. "From the look of things, I don't believe he was shot here," he said, emerging from under the cloth. "What do you think?" "It doesn't seem so to me either," Edward said, bending down, putting a finger to the bloodstain on the dead man's chest. "There's grassy debris on the congealed blood, as if he died face down, and yet he was found in this position, lying on his side. There's no blood on the ground beneath or around him either, although there should have been if he died here." "Are those grass seeds in the blood?" Charles asked. Edward straightened up. "See for yourself." Charles took a folding lens out of one of the pockets of his bulky coat and knelt beside the body. After a moment of close inspection in the wound, he took out a penknife and a small square of oiled paper and scraped a sample of debris from the bloody jacket onto the paper. He folded it carefully and put it into another pocket. "From the size of the entry wound," he said, "the weapon appears to have been of rather large caliber. Not likely a rifle, though, since there's no exit wound. Most probably a pistol." He stood up. "Shot in the heart, it seems." "If he wasn't killed here," Edward said, "he must have been dragged through that gap in the hedge. That's Lamb Lane on the other side." Charles pocketed his penknife, followed Edward to the hedge, and studied the ground carefully. The soil was packed and hard, and there were no footprints. But there were indications that something had been dragged through the gap, and on a twig at the height of his elbow he found something interesting. A triangular flag of faded red cloth about the size of his thumbnail. He repositioned the camera, photographed the cloth, and then retrieved it carefully. It went into another piece of oiled paper. "May I take this and the scrapings?" he asked. "You'll get them back." Edward nodded. "You're thinking the killer left this scrap behind?" Lawrence was wearing a blue jacket," Charles remarked thoughtfully. "What colored dress was his companion wearing?" "I'll find out." Edward jotted something in his notebook. He looked up as a cart pulled by a brown horse and driven by 2 uniformed policemen came to a stop in the lane. "A chap's from Colchester," he said bleakly. "They're here for the body." Charles began to repack his gear. "I'd appreciate a copy of the surgeon's notes," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Edward put away his notebook. "Would you mind coming with me?" "To Bishop's Keep." Edward's face was grim. "To Gallows Green. Archie's widow has yet to be told."